Okay, we've talked about the intent of church being quite clear, and the most important thing is that churches understand what they are aiming to do and seeking to do under God to live out the mission. Let me now move on to what the Effective Ministry Project acknowledged as the key drivers, if you like, in the average church if you want to be a growing church. Now again, I want to say to you, this is for the average church, and every church is different. So you need to listen to this through the lens of, does this apply to my church? But what the Effective Ministry team established is that if we could focus on 4 things over 4 years with very modest assumptions, we could potentially, under God, grow the church 4-fold. Think about that. Focusing on 4 things over 4 years to see a 4-fold increase in the size of the average church. What were those 4 things? Well, you can see on this graphic here. The first thing is that we would grow, train and appoint leaders who would be focused on making disciples who make others. The second thing is knowing that God brings so many people in through our doors that we would greet, meet and integrate them, and we could double the size of our church. The third thing is to know that there's enormous transition and relocation in our system, that if we could be better at inviting and evangelizing the people in our area, we could increase the size of our church more than 100%, another 150%. And finally, youth and children, which shouldn't even be on this chart because everything we say here should be about all age ranges. But specifically youth and children, if we could do a better job of retaining them, dare I say discipling them, we could increase the size of a church another 50%. So let's walk through each of those one by one and challenge those assumptions. The first one is grow, train and appoint. Let me take you back to that chart which looked at the number of people in that average church of 100. Do you remember us saying there were about 3 times the size of the congregation who called this their church but were turning up worse than monthly and better than a year? Our aim here and our hypothesis is if we could just grow their faith, mature them as Christians, they would come more often. If we could just get 1/3 of those people to come weekly, we'd double the size of the church. And that's the assumption that was made. As we dug into that area and we thought about that, what you realise is that because 60% of people in the average church are in small groups become an extraordinary influence on the culture of a church. What's more important to recognise is that small group leaders have a significant impact on the culture of a church. Just think about that. The leader of a church stands up each Sunday and they preach and they lead whatever they say, and the average person sitting in the chairs is influenced by what they say and how they behave and the way they treat the scriptures, etc. But they very rarely get close enough to that preacher, that teacher, that leader to imbibe their culture. But with small groups, we might put 10 people in a small group, and now we're putting 10 people in a situation where they are both in an intimate environment, maybe a lounge room, and with a high frequency, maybe every week or every fortnight, looking at that leader, and they will come to imitate the way that leader behaves if they respect them. Remember in the scriptures, Paul mentions many times, and in the letter to the Hebrews, this idea of imitation. We need to recognise that this is the case. We have a diagnostic tool we do with churches, and of all of the chapters in that diagnostic tool, the one chapter that is the strongest predictor of a growing church is the chapter on small groups. And more often, the churches that have higher scores for the best practice framework we have for small groups are more likely to be growing churches. The Effective Ministry team read a whole lot of books on small groups from Australia and around the world, did a whole bunch of interviews and focus groups, etc., to try and understand what best practice might look like in a church. And what you can see on the screen now is a sort of diagrammatic of what the norm looks like versus best practice. Essentially, when you look at best practice, there are three elements that need to be taken into mind. The most important of them is, of course, leadership. We want to have a clear understanding amongst leaders of to what is expected and what we are trying to achieve. We want to select and recruit leaders whom we will trust the people who in their group too. And then we want to train and equip leaders to be doing what we as a church wish to do. This is the area that I think is most underdone in the average church. We run workshops with small group leaders, and what you find is very rarely do they understand the purpose of their small group is to make disciples who will make other disciples. In fact, our stereotype is that if you ask the average small group leader, is their growth group, is their small group effective? What you'll often find is a mixture of results. Some people will say, effective means I lead a good study. We had good engagement. We got on well. We're a good environment. All of these things are good. But if the objective of the church is to grow people in their faith, make disciples who will make other disciples, then we're focusing on the wrong things. And so it's so important that we help leaders to understand the purpose of our small groups. The second thing is the area of the core elements. And as a church, we want to build a culture where we understand what the core elements of a small group are made up of. Of course, we're going to pray. Of course, we're going to read the scriptures. Of course, we're going to pray for each other and support each other one to one. Best practice involves thinking about mission in many, many different ways. It could be doing mission together. It could be praying about mission together. But what we often find is that people understand what the purpose of the group is and what they're trying to do. What we don't do is straitjacket a leader to only do it this way. We give the leader trust and flexibility to achieve the outcomes we're seeking to achieve. And because of 1 and 2, the third part of effectiveness in small group leadership is really about assessing quality. I think one of the most important tools for small group leaders is to evaluate regularly how we're going against our objective of making disciples. When I run a workshop, I ask small group leaders to come up with a 6-monthly objective, an objective that might relate to growth in faith or an activity that leads to growth in faith. And I ask those people who are overseeing small group leaders to follow up at the end of each quarter. How are you going against that objective? Keep reminding people that that's what we are evaluating against so that we don't slip back into our mentality of what good looks like. You'll also see on the chart that what we found is that best practice often involved this idea of a sunset understanding, as in we close groups from time to time. We do believe that is a helpful tool. You might disagree, and that's fine. But what we found with sunset understanding is that churches that turned their groups over and reinvigorated their groups allowed more people to come in, allowed more people to mix, and allowed more leaders to be moved into leadership. And so we want to encourage that as something you might consider. So at the end of the day, the first area of growth is to recognise that with 60% of people in the average church in small groups, we should be focusing on that strongly and leveraging that to grow people in their faith. The second aspect of effective ministry is pretty straightforward. If God keeps bringing people in through the doors of the church, we should be doing a better job of welcoming them, of meeting, greeting them, and integrating them. You know, when I first started in this role, I had about 6 ministers come up to me and say, "You know, Peter, I thought this data was garbage. I thought the idea that there were 3 people visiting my church each Sunday was a load of codswallop. But I want to tell you, Peter, I've been watching my back door for the last 6 months, and it's true." And almost with tears, they would say, "But I never saw them." Now, if you're a minister of a 1,000-person church, I understand it's very difficult to see visitors walk in. If you're a minister of a 100-person church, it may be easier to see visitors walk in. But here's the truth that we need to recognise. In the average church, ministers are leading from the front of the church, not the door of the church. They're organising Sunday more often than not, and they're involved in coordination and preparation. Why would we expect that a minister would be able to do the welcoming, the meeting and greeting, as well as anybody else? We need to very quickly realise that the welcoming part of church needs to be owned by lay people. And there's a few reasons for that. The first thing we need to recognise as it comes to visitors is that visitors are hard to see. In fact, if you look at the average attendance in a church, and this is just one example, it fluctuates all the time. And if you draw the line of best fit through, what you'll see is there's not a lot of change. But if you're looking at the details, you will see that there are people coming in all the time. But what you'll also find as they walk in is that we as a church tend to have a narrow franchise of people. We're overrepresented in the church of people who are married, and because of our age, people who are widowed. We're often underrepresented in the church community of people who've never been married, or people who are de facto, or divorced, or separated. And so we need to recognise that as we welcome people into the church, they might be coming from a different place to what we're coming from. That's even before we recognise that there are different cultures and people are coming from all nations to Australia. And so when we think about meet, greet and integrate, or welcoming, we need to think deeply about how we do it. What we found is that with very, very modest assumptions, if we could just retain 25% of visitors, we would double the size of the church over 4 years. And we've seen churches where this has been done. But there are a few other things that are worthwhile knowing when it comes to welcoming. The first thing is people think that visitors only come to a special service. That is not true. In one survey, we found that 7 in 10 people, their first experience of church was a bog standard ordinary service. You know what I've come to find? Is the average person, when they come to the ordinary service, is pleasantly surprised with what they see. Now just think about that for a moment. You and I are expecting that they will find it dissatisfying or unusual, and they may find it unusual, but your average person walks in and what they find it is better than they expected. Think about that person. It may be someone who hasn't been to church for years, but they had an experience of church maybe when they were at school or maybe when they were young. And you and I both know, because you've been there and I've been there, many of you, it was as boring as all get out back then. I don't know about you, but I counted bricks. Why? Because I didn't know how to listen to a 20-minute talk. And so right through the talk, I'd be counting bricks and I'd be bored. But you know, the person who was that person and who now comes to church 20 years later, or 10 years later, or even 5 years later, they're expecting it to be boring. And they will say it was better than they expected. Why? Because they've changed in the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. They've changed and can now listen and interact with a 20-minute, a 15-minute, a 1-hour talk. Now, they may not agree with it, but it will be better than they expected. So I want to say, have confidence to invite people to the ordinary service and recognise that there are people at your ordinary service who need welcoming. The second thing that I think needs to be understood is when you ask people, what happened that made you most successfully feel welcomed? This survey said 50% of the people said an attender spoke to me. A bog standard attender spoke to me. Now think about that. What happens when the minister comes and shakes your hand? You say, that's nice, but he or she are paid to welcome me. But when a person who's not a minister shakes their hand, more often than not, someone says, "What a nice church. Bob, Mary, welcome to me. What a great person." And I've made a connection. And so good welcoming is not just done by clergy, by ministers, by staff. Good welcoming is done by lay folk, by you and me. And our experience is it only takes about 5% of people in a church to begin welcoming for you to become a welcoming church. Because those 5% will see people lonely there in the pews and they will go and say hello. Just thinking about that, when do you think is the most lonely time in a service? Now sure, there are many times when you walk in, when you wait for the church to start, because of course visitors come on time and many people in church come late. There are times, but there's one time that is consistently lonely. It's the 1 or 2 minutes after the end of the service. You know, everyone sits down and they sit there and they don't know what to do. What we've learned is that the average person will sit there for about a minute. They're sitting there, they're waiting for you, and they're giving you an opportunity to come and say hello. And if you don't come and say hello, they will make their mind up that they have not been welcomed. And they will walk out the back door. You can try and catch them on the way out the back door, but many of them have emotionally made their exit and you've missed them. Friends, there is such an opportunity for us to engage and welcome people. And welcoming churches will not just welcome at the front door, but they will come and welcome in the seats. They will make sure they go and speak to the person if there's a break and at the end of the service, because they know that it is lonely in the midst of a room where everyone else knows each other. And the truth is, from good data, it doesn't take long for someone to feel like they belong, which also means it doesn't take long for someone to feel like they don't belong. We can work on this. And so, on the screen now, you can see there's a chart here for what we think is good practice. As we set out, as the effective ministry team set out, they found out that the average church did 3 things. They had greeters at the front, they had a visitor's card, and the staff did a call. But what we learned is that best practice involves more than that. Best practice involves some way of identifying a person, labels, name cards, whatever it is. Greeters were there, but more than greeters. When you get to a certain size, you need to have ushers, people who will walk you to the seat and help you to find a comfortable place. People who will introduce you to the idea of a visitor's card and a welcome. People who will explain, this is the way we do things at this church, you are most welcome. People who will take your children. Let's face it, we care more about how you treat our children sometimes than how you treat us. So people who will take care of your children and checking in your children and build the reputation of the church that we treat children well in the way we check in. And you can trust us with your children. Yes, a visitor card is important, but we've learned what is more important is that the church understands a clear pathway for next steps for integration. You see, we don't want this person just to visit. We want them to integrate and engage. And that starts in the first meeting. You know, what we've found is that churches that have a clear pathway, the welcomers, the ushers, the people who meet the people, actually introduce the pathway. It's funny, a simple pathway could be someone who is unchurched, we bring them to a welcoming event. It's amazing. That person who is welcoming says, oh, we have a bifurcation here. We have a unchurched and churched. Straight away, they have in their head a question that they're comfortable with to work out whether someone is churched or unchurched. Oh, hi, I'm Peter. Nice to meet you. You ever been to church before? As soon as they answer that question, I know we have a destination. People in this church who are unchurched, we take them to the welcoming event. People who are churched, well, we might take them to the welcoming event, or maybe small groups are the next step. And you watch, we start selling small groups as the next step. So churches that do this well have a clear pathway of next steps. Churches who do this well also have what we call pew or church missionaries. What that means, old language of pew, is that people are willing to go into the chairs to welcome the person and take ownership. And they are able to do this triage of churched or unchurched and follow and progress the pathway. They are also able to be the person who follows them up and looks out for them next week. You see, Christ asked us to love each other. And this is one of the key ways to love someone when they walk into your church for the first time. Follow-up call could be done by staff, but it could be done by that person. But of course, there will be some sort of invitation to the next step in best practice, and make sure that it happens. And in most churches, you find that integration finds its completion when the person is involved in those small groups or whatever it is that you do as your norm. So welcome and integration can be done well. And if we do it well, with modest assumptions, we can potentially double the size of a church over 4 years. The third area of the Effective Ministry Project was to recognise transition, relocation and invitation. And this is where the evangelism largely sits for the church. In this area, we need to recognise that there's a big reason why most people leave your church. Do you know what it is? Most people leave your church because they move house. Most people join your church partially because they find a reason to come to your church, but also because they moved into the area. And so we shouldn't be too worried about relocation and people leaving and coming. Now, we should understand if people leave for other reasons, but the biggest reason is simply because they move. And what that means is there is an enormous opportunity for us to keep meeting new people in our community. In the average community in Australia, what you'll find is about 40% of the population arrived every 5 years. That means that there's enormous diversity. And some of those people will even call themselves your denomination or your type of church or your style of church. They just need to know you're there. Let me remind you, at least 30% of them believe that Jesus' resurrection is history, and another 35% of them are not sure. The harvest is enormous. Let me remind you again also that a quarter of those who used to go to church, so this is not the churched people, but a quarter of those who used to go to church would accept your invitation, and 1 in 10 who have never been to church will accept your invitation. As Christians, we need to mobilise ourselves to recognise this and invite people into our churches and give them a chance. Yeah, there are things we know about evangelism and communication. There are things we can definitely do to connect in a positive way. And there are lots of training and things that we can do. But we need to recognise we have an opportunity to invite. Let me remind you, the reputation of the church in our culture may well be sullied, but the reputation of Christ and his love endures. And so we want to invite people not necessarily to church, but to know Christ and to join us as we worship Christ, worship our God to his glory. The opportunity in this space is just enormous. And that is why you can almost triple the size of a church with modest assumptions in this area. Very modest assumptions. In fact, the assumptions made were that if 16% for a Protestant church, if 16% of Protestants who moved into your area accepted an invitation, you would add another 2 times to the size of your church. That's tripling the size of your church over 4 years. The opportunity, friends, is enormous, but it rests on us letting people know, A, that we are there, B, that they are welcome, and C, that when they come, we welcome them well. The final area that the Effective Ministry Project highlighted is a controversial area. And in some ways, it's only controversial because we shouldn't even be talking about it. Youth and children should be something that we do in the same way we do everything, but age appropriate. But unfortunately, it is a marker that we need to understand, and it is a marker of our nominalism. Let me start by saying we know with good data that about 75% of us became Christians before we hit the age of 20. Only 25% of us became Christians after the age of 20. That says two things. It says that youth and childhood is really influential and important, but it also perhaps says we're not as effective as we should be as we think about people over the age of 20. We need to be better at evangelism. But this chart, this terrible loss, is an indictment on all of us. You see, the truth is we lose the children from our church. What you find is many of them leave at the age of 16 or as they leave school. But what we need to recognise is that's just the time that we give them permission to make that choice. Experts tell me that the time when that decision is actually made is closer to the age of 12 or 13. Yes, that transition from primary school into high school. Friends, children ministry and youth ministry is essential. This data is a conviction of us that we can be accused of churching our children and not discipling them. And so when the transitions of life start to appear, they don't have the roots in Christ that they might have. They don't have the belief and the firmness in Christ that they may have. They just have a social link to a church. And so that's an easy thing to leave and to make a choice. Why do they leave? Well, good work tells us they leave because life circumstances change. They grew out of it, which means they didn't have roots. Very good work in the US shows this painful truth in reality. We like to think that we grow the church in youth and children, but the net effect on this chart is negative in youth and children. You see, if on this chart you've got positive growth as blue, negative growth as red, and what you can see is through the first few decades of life, our church is a bloodbath of people leaving the church. Now, the US situation is different to ours. People tend to do college in the US in another city at least, and then they come back and they've changed forever. Our situation is different, but our results are no different. What we do see is that people come back to the church as they start to change their phase of life and maybe get married or have children or something like that. And of course, there's that great red bloodbath at the end. Unfortunately, despite God's gift of the pharmaceutical industry, we haven't been able to prevent people from dying at the end of their life. And so we see people leaving the church as they die. What we find is that growing churches tend to have more young people in their churches. Surprise, surprise. Young people in churches means families in churches. As families come to your church, one of the most appealing aspects is, will you look after my children? In fact, that's the first thing people look for. But as you look at discipleship of children and you want to understand, so who are the most important disciplers of our children? Surely they're the Sunday school teachers, they're the kids leaders, they're the head of kids ministry, they're the youth leader, they're the inspirational minister. Now, you and I both know that's not the truth. Time and time again, we learn that mother and father are the most important influences on whether a child will grow up to be a Christian or not. People who become a Christian after the age of 20, yes, some of those other people are the most influential, but parenting is the place where discipling is done. And so the question we have to ask is, how good are we as a church in helping parents to disciple their children? It's interesting, in this piece of research, when you ask people who are the most important people for discipling your children, people will say quite clearly, it is not the pastor, it is the parents. Strongly agree. And yet, when you ask parents how much time they spend discipling their children, the answer is extraordinarily variable. But unfortunately, when you ask churches how often they are equipping parents to disciple their children, the answer is not variable. It is low. And so, folks, if we want to be growing children as disciples, we need to recognise that we need to help parents to grow as disciplers. Many churches, larger churches in particular, work on what the experts refer to as the one-eared Mickey Mouse model. It's a model that runs the church as a whole and then employs a youth leader on the side to run youth as a silo. The experts have come to know that this is a bad model. Now let me be clear, it's not saying it's a bad model to have a strong youth ministry, but it's a bad model to have it so separate that there's no integration. So what we would encourage churches to recognise is youth ministry needs to be strong, but it needs to form links so that the youth are meeting with the rest of the church and are not disparate to the church practice. We have a paper on effective youth and children's ministry, and I want to encourage you to read it. There are lots of areas of best practice that are very, very complex. They start with having the right focus on discipleship. They move through equipping parenting, but they also then deal with helping people with transition and helping people engage as they move through life. And this is an area that is not easy, but with great intent, we can make a difference. So the question I want to ask you is, can we make a difference under God? Can we be more effective in the way we do ministry? Yes, we can. If we can recognise that we have the attribute of leadership gifted to us and people in our churches respect us, we have a great start. If we can leverage that to help people to understand what the purpose of our church is, what the mission of our church is, and then make sure that everything we do serves that mission and drives that mission. That we would help people to grow as disciples, sitting personally and corporately under God's word and in prayer, and encouraging them to live out their faith personally, through giving, through invitation and sharing faith, and following up people who are no longer here, and in reaching out to their community. That is what a healthy church looks like. And in effective ministry, we can focus on just a few things to do that effectively. If we focus on just a few things, we can potentially, under God, grow our church fourfold over 4 years. The effective ministry team were very generous and created papers on this best practice. A paper on small groups, a paper on pastoral care in small groups, a paper on meet, greet, integrate, a paper on youth and children's ministry, and a paper on transitions. All of those papers are available on our website. Please take the time to read through them and reflect on them. You don't have to agree with everything in them. That's not important. What is important is that you read through them and take out what you think is most helpful for your church. We hope that this material has been helpful to you to identify the few key things that you might do to focus on living out the mission of Christ in your church. That you might be effective in leading people in Christ's mission, and that we might see more people growing in their love for Christ, for God, and see more people coming to know Him and being in His kingdom. Having said that, we have recognised that implementation is the hardest thing to do. And that's why we've created an organisation to support pastors and to support churches in implementation. If we can help you, please make contact with us through our website, because we would love to support you on this wonderful journey to see Christ's mission lived out. May God bless you richly.